Just to remind you to please mute your mic and stay off camera while you're not speaking, just for the presenters to be able to speak without interruption. And I'll hand over directly to our chair, Antara Ganguly, for the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you
Stop
so
sharing so we can see each other better.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Namaste, assalamu alaikum, buenos dias, bonjour, jambo. And especially to friends who are fasting during Ramzan, a good day to you, and thank you for joining us today. I'm starting with these various greetings in different languages because they illustrate a key facet of our discussion today. The truth is that our world is very diverse and is plural, and our communities are as well. So even though we have all of these different languages and ways of expressing the greeting, actually the greetings are all portraying the same emotion. So moving that to education, if the problem statement is that 250 million children today are not in school, and most children who are in school are not learning to read, write, and count sufficiently, the answers you will hear today from Cambridge Education colleagues has two themes. That our response to these children has to be local and has to be in partnership. We are in a particular moment in time in international development. Last week, DevX, a global online news site dedicated to international development issues, asked the question, does the Global South still want localization? I thought that was a very, very troubling question and deliberately provocative in terms of ambitions of countries of what we want to achieve for ourselves. But the webinar today is going to answer that question for education in Africa. This webinar, of course, is a part of a series of Cambridge Education Legacy webinars, sharing learning from over 40 years of experience that Cambridge Education has working in international education. In this webinar particularly, we will talk about the broad range of actors that Cambridge Education has worked with in many countries, including Rwanda, Sierra Leone, the DRC. We're going to be exploring the challenges and opportunities of building diverse partnerships and the lessons that emerge for what this means. The goal of these partnerships is that every actor in the country is invested in achieving these results. And how can we, and Cambridge Education will show through the examples, ensure that the local actors are the most invested and indeed have the most power. Before I hand over back to Mathilde, I have a question that I hope we can keep at the back of our minds as we listen to my colleagues' reflections. When done right, localization shifts not just resources, but power. And I'm sure everybody who is here for this webinar will agree that that is the goal. To be a bit radical, can we imagine a world in which local actors provide both? So with that question, I'm going to turn it back to Mathilde.
Thank you very much, Antara, for this great opening. I thought to present myself. So I'm Mathilde Nicolai. I'm a senior education advisor at Cambridge Education, and I'm the discussant for today's webinar. So this is a series of legacy webinars, all looking at system coherence and institutionalizing change, because we think as Cambridge that this is really key to make sure any change or anything we do really is embedded, owned, and sustained over time. This webinar in particular looks at partnerships with local actors, but mostly what is their place within the wider ecosystem. Of course, we've worked much more closely with the national system, the official government system, but these local actors, they're part of this wider ecosystem of education in their own country, and they're key to many parts of the system and to many processes and behaviors of the system. Today, we'll speak about local actors in the broader term. So, involving faith-based organizations, involving organizations of people with disabilities, women-led organizations, CSOs, youth groups, but also community leaders, religious leaders, etc. It's a very broad range of actors we're speaking about, including parents and communities directly. So the roles of these actors, they vary drastically depending on the situation. And we learned through our projects how to work with them to influence the agenda in some cases, influence the government, shift political dynamics, and enable system change. We also explored how they can fill gaps that the government cannot fill, particularly when we're speaking about reaching the most marginalized. And today we are sharing lessons we learned through 40 plus years of Cambridge Education experience of working with these local actors. And we changed our ways of working throughout the time, from considering them as delivery mechanisms only in some cases, to really co-designing and co-creating with them and empowering them to hold governments to account. So we will share what we learned, what worked, what didn't work, and why we think is that through various examples from Sierra Leone, the GRC, Tanzania, Rwanda, and others. So I'm introducing our three panelists. Sadly, we're missing one currently, but we have Alicia Mills, who has had a huge experience from the Girls Education Challenge and is now leading the technical fund for out-of-school children in the LIFT project in Rwanda, funded by FCDO. We also have Virginie Briand, who is the former team leader of Acceler in DRC, also funded by FCDO, a governance project in the education system, and is the current team leader of the Shule Bora project in Tanzania. And our third panelist, who I really hope will appear, is Mohamed Barry. He's our team leader for SSCIP, the Lewiland project in Sierra Leone, and has been working with us on this project for, I think, almost 10 years. So let me start with our first question, and it will go first to Virginie. The first question is, how did working with local actors shift the political dynamics and enable system change in your context in ways that working only with governments could not? Virginie, if you want to start, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mathilde. Hi, everyone. So let me share a few examples on how we've been working, because I mean, as Antara and Mathilde have said, I think we all agree on the fact that yes, we need to work with local actors, right, as part of the system strengthening. And if you remember what we went through when we discussed during our first seminar, we were talking about coherence. So local actors are really part of this overall coherence of the system. And if you want to make sure that, the systems are really working and improving towards a better governance, we need to make sure we are working with all different kinds of local actors. The question is not so much, the what, but the how do we want to do that. And I think from our experience, the difference happens when the how is really being carefully considered. And that starts with clearly mapping out how the system is working and how this system should also be working. So meaning, of course, at central level, but also regional and local levels. And very often what happens and what we can see is that, the local actors, which are part of the demand side, which can hold into account the state actors, they are not really part of the system. And very often themselves, they don't even feel they are being part of the system. They don't have this understanding, they don't have this awareness, and very often they don't feel like they have the legitimacy in doing so. So I think for us, having making sure those actors would be part of the system and could play their role within this local system or the regional system was very important. So let me start with an example in DRC when we're working on the school fees. on the school fees. So, we were facing situations where parents couldn't send their children to schools because they had to pay huge school fees, and then children were, out of the education system. So, for instance, in Equateur, what we did, we started to do some training of regional parliamentarians. Which can seem a bit strange, right, at the beginning. But the thing is that those parliamentarians had no clue about, the school fees. They had never, they got elected as parliamentarians, but they didn't know what were their responsibilities. They didn't have a PFM background. And then, they were not able to take into account the regional authorities. So when we started to, train them on PFM and make them aware of, okay, what is the Constitution telling us in terms of the school fees, and what is your role within the system that you could play, and for you to be able to tackle the situation and make a change for the parents and the families. I think that started to really see some changes. So we trained them in Equateur, for instance. And then they had decided, and they pushed the regional government to stop asking for school fees for the Pygmy population, which was totally out of the system. Pygmy children were not going to the school anymore because of those fees, and that was a major shift that we saw, and in their understanding, but also in the reality of how the system was working. And we have a similar example in South Ubangi, in DRC as well, where we also worked with parliamentarians. And they, at some point, we also trained them on PFM, and then they started also to push back on the central government, because the situation in regard to the school fees in DRC was that the central government, for many reasons, like they were asking more and more and more school fees. And at some point, the regional parliamentarians say, no, we don't want you to ask for those school fees to our parents and families in our region. And they push it back. And those school fees were not applied in South Ubangi. So those are two concrete examples at regional level. But what we did, because in DRC, the faith-based organizations, especially the Catholic Church, play a huge role within the education system. And, and when we started to reach out to them, they felt like they were not legitimate to push back on the school fees, and they didn't know what was their role to play within the system in regard to that. So we started to discuss with them. That was very sensitive. So it was a lot of working politically and making sure we were on the same page and understand the different perspective where they were coming from. And step by step, we started to raise their awareness that they also had a role to play, and maybe they could start also pushing back on the central government and ask for the central government to, map out the different school fees, see which one were the, let's say, legitimate ones, because none of them were actually, because the Constitution was telling them that, education should be free. But incrementally, step by step, we started to raise awareness and work with them so that they could start to challenge at the Ministry of Education level. And meanwhile, I think because, NGOs are also part of the system, we started to work with NGOs at central and regional level to have a communication campaign so that the parents and the communities could understand what was the reality of the school fees, and could understand that there was what they were suffering from on a daily basis, but that was also what was saying the Constitution, and that maybe in between there was a role for them to hold the government into account and to ask for accountability as well. And on those 3-4 examples, we've been successful because we have tried to work at the different level of the system so that there was coherence, within the system horizontally and vertically as well. I'm going to stop here, Mathilde. I just don't want to be too long. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Virginie. I'll hand over to Barry to discuss the Sierra Leone ecosystem of local actors.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mathilde. Yeah, so interestingly, in Sierra Leone,
if you can all please mute yourself, please. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Interestingly, in Sierra Leone, the CSO or the local actors, they often represent specific groups. So it's either girls focus, out of school girls or pregnant girls, or some of them are they focus on disability inclusion or working with parent groups or women. So they always represent specific thematic issues. And in most cases, they represent specific districts or regions within the country. So if you like, they are specialized in their own ways, but they're able to, their strength is to work within the confines of their specialties or representing those groups. So I think many of the local actors that we worked with realized that their experience in policy formulation and awareness raising to actually to a large extent, they also engage in advocacy, but on their based on their specialities. So, for instance, when we assisted the Ministry of Education to formulate a couple of policies, including the radical inclusion policy, the national referral protocol, the teacher code of conduct, and the reducing violence in school guides. So CSOs were consulted, and they actually brought specialized and a perspective on pregnant girls and out-of-school girls. Some of them brought perspective on children with disabilities, which were actually, if you like, included in those policies. So some of them were involved in popularizing these policies using various media channels, in most cases focusing on their constituencies, focusing on the groups and people that they represent. But I think it's worth emphasizing that CSOs struggle a lot to implement large-scale and comprehensive system strengthening program because they are not set up to do that. They're just not set up to do that. And they just lack the technical and operational capacity to deliver a system strengthening approach, particularly where the emphasis is to work in depth with system actors. So where we emphasize improving technical and operational capabilities and perspective and the attitude of the system actors to deliver services that are linked to improving learning outcomes. So they are not set up for doing that. And interestingly, the programs that we have implemented in Sierra Leone, the emphasis is deeply, particularly the past 3 years, with the second phase of Levelland, the emphasis is system strengthening. We want to work with the system actors. We want to think, plan, deliver, and learn with them. So fortunately, that civil society organizations are not set up for that. And I think the other emphasis is that it's always easy to say local actors are not set up for that. We also realize that loads of INGOs, the traditional INGOs, are also not set up to work that way. Most of them are good with policy formulation, awareness raising, advocacy, representing specific groups. They're good with doing that. And when it comes to comprehensive, large-scale system strengthening approaches, there's always a gap. Mathilde, over to you.
Thanks, Barry. Alicia, over to you for an example from Rwanda, and I will share the slides right now.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. Yes, like Virginie mentioned, that mapping piece is so important of understanding both the problems and how they link to each other, but also the role that local actors already play and how that might be enhanced. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the mapping we did around the first problem, global, huge problem that Antara mentioned, that of the very high numbers of out-of-school children. So in Rwanda, this is a key government political priority with tons of momentum around it. And importantly, also a really important government-led program to get children, out-of-school children, back into school. So against that, against that very positive context, we felt like this was a time of real opportunity to be making real impact in this area. So of course, I just want to show you two things on this slide that sort of show where the two key problems were and how local actors were so well placed to start to shift some of the more problematic dynamics around this. So I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but essentially on the left-hand side, you've got 4 different profiles of out-of-school adolescents that we identified. So the first, the top left, if you can read, it's sometimes we refer to these children as sort of low-hanging fruit. So maybe out of school more temporarily. The reasons behind it are more straightforward, and often communities and schools, the most central of actors, they rally and can champion and can often solve many of those issues themselves. As we get further down those list of profiles, the complexity increases, the reason why those children are out of school becomes more multidimensional, age increases, and as age increases, there several other adolescence-related issues happen, but also systems tend to want to drive those older children into different kinds of pathways than primary school. On the bottom left, you see that missing child. Here I've put some question marks and said invisible. We felt, and this was very much based on the learnings of the Girls' Education Challenge, that in any program, there are always going to be children who are the most invisible, the most marginalized. And we did feel on the GEC there were successive phases where we tried to capture and respond to these concerns of these children. But it's really hard. The children with severe disabilities, the young parents who've also got very high income generating responsibilities, who've got no social network, no support, no trusted friends, protection issues, complexity, where those children were just completely invisible to the program. And if they were invisible to the program designed to find them and respond to their needs, they were certainly invisible to the system. By its nature, education systems mostly designed to cater to the masses of children that, of course, they need to respond to. So we were interested in how local actors were well placed to make these invisible children more visible. And then the second problem we wanted to tackle was how do we move beyond just enrollment? I'm sure it's a conversation that happens in every context. Yes, out of school children, it's fairly easy to take them to school on day one after a back to school campaign and write their name in a register. But how do we support them to thrive, to be learning, for their family to be supportive, for them to be safe, and for them to be progressing grade to grade and eventually some kind of transition is a really huge challenge. And we felt that, well, it wasn't just a feeling, it was based on a mapping of a whole ecosystem and landscape and multiple participatory consultations with both government and with CSOs. We knew that it was local actors and often the smallest CSOs who knew about these problems inside out and were well aware of what was needed to help an individual child to thrive within that context. So based on all of that mapping, I really like what Antara said about the most invested and the most power. They were certainly found to be the most invested, but on a very small scale, and often pushed to those margins. So unable sometimes to have a seat at decision-making tables, even on a very small level like the school level, but certainly on a more sort of local government level, and often also forced to work in quite an incoherent way. So for example, there is quite good provision for children whose families cannot afford to pay a school feeding contribution. But there's limited knowledge of that policy and implementation. And none of those local CSOs were advocating on that particular issue, which was leading to more children dropping out again. So there were so many different linkages that we found might be able to be made if we could map out that whole ecosystem, identify where those breaks in that chain were, and support those local actors to have more of a voice.
Thank you so much, Antara. Alicia, sorry. Great. I'm going to move to the second question and let the slide here because I think Alicia will just continue from there. Yeah. The second question is in your programs, what capacities or roles did local actors bring that government alone could not deliver, particularly for reaching the most marginalized, like Alicia was just saying? And how did you strengthen or amplify those capacities? Alicia, over to you.
Thanks, Mathilde. If you could please go to the next slide. Yeah. So one of our aims connected to what I just spoke about in the black box on top of the school there you can see, was that we could contribute towards stronger, better resource CSOs working more coherently and with greater influence and ability to have improved impact. But I suppose what's a little bit not quite right about that statement is it really undersells the deep capacities and strengths that those CSOs had well before LIFT came along. And I think that there in the yellow boxes there are some of the things that we really wanted to. Let me just find another version where I've just got 4 different ones. The 4 sort of main strengths that I think they brought that we have tried to amplify. So the first one was around identifying the invisible. I think I spoke about that a little bit before. So for example, we've got one partner who's very small, is actually led by a group of nuns, and through their own desire to understand every child in their community, they're covering a few sectors within a district. They wanted to understand every child with a disability in those districts. So when we posed to them ideas around using CFM, using existing government data to identify those children, they were really happy to work with that, but they also felt like they had already understood who is not visible, who has never gone to school, who has been at home, who are the children who communities don't really like to talk about. So that was a real strength that local actors were able to bring, and something that government colleagues just did not have the bandwidth or the community connections to really engage with. The second point was around understanding nuance and especially intersectionality. So again, if I talk about disability, because it is a really good example, often our government colleagues, or certainly larger organizations, would really do that thing that we all know happens a lot, perhaps we do ourselves sometimes, which is just sort of lump groups with certain characteristics together. Like, this is for teenage mothers and this is for children with disabilities, without understanding the intersections of different individual characteristics, responsibilities, lived experience. And those local actors kind of lived and breathed that, really, and could come up with very localized solutions in many different occasions, just through a kind of almost like an intuitive understanding of that. The third thing was around reach and bandwidth. So not only were the local actors better able to reach homes in particular and households and families, but we also found just a practical logistical ability to mobilize, especially volunteers at scale. And I think something that we do as people interested in system strengthening is make assumptions about the ability of government connected people to do things that we believe are needed for an education program. So for example, we'll say, look, how many community health workers there are in this community? Why don't we ask the community health workers to just go to the house of every child who's absent and see how they're getting on with their retention? But that is there are many assumptions in that idea, and many flaws, not least related to resources, related to time, bandwidth, ministry mandate, etc. Often our partners have the ability to sort of motivate and mobilize hundreds, thousands of genuinely committed individual volunteers. And yes, while that comes with issues sometimes, it also means they can get that reach out there to the most marginalized much more effectively. The last point was around speaking with authority. And I wonder if this connects to a discussion we might have around power and where it is and where it is not, how we can build it or amplify it. But we have noticed that when our colleagues from those local actors have a seat at the table, which sometimes we need to make space for and move ourselves back from also, when they do have that seat at the table, they are listened to and respected. They are speaking with authority because they're speaking from a position of people who understand what it's like to be an out-of-school child, an out-of-school adolescent who's dealing with multiple different daily realities and daily problems. And that authority isn't easy to manufacture, and it's much more powerful when it's coming from the bottom up. And it's an interesting challenge for us. How can we amplify that in a really sustainable way and allow coherent links to be made by those actors themselves with us taking a smaller role in this as well? Thanks, Mathilde.
Thanks, Alicia. I will now hand over to Barry again for the second question about the how we amplified or strengthened capacities of local actors to fill some gaps that the government couldn't provide in the education system.
Yeah, okay, thank you again, Martin. No, definitely, as I mentioned earlier, I think most of the local actors are specialized in what they do. So they are special. They always specialize either in disability inclusion and, as I mentioned earlier, in pregnant girls, out of school girls. So definitely they have a role. They have relevance in implementing large-scale programs. So, for instance, the programs that we've implemented in Sierra Leone, one key outcome of the Levelland program is actually to contribute to improving learning outcomes for all learners in secondary schools. So, but with emphasis on girls and children with disability. So if you like, that's what we've been doing for almost a decade in this country. So in fact, the emphasis on girls and children with disabilities aligns well with the radical inclusion policy, which is the revered policy of the Ministry of Education. And I think just to be specific here, one key bit of implementing the radical inclusion policy is to actually make schools safe and conducive for all learners, and with emphasis on marginalized groups, girls and children with disabilities. So to do that, we assisted the Ministry of Education to establish the school safety system. And the school safety system is to ensure that there are functioning school safety committees in every school, and schools have mentors, and Girls and Boys Club, Community Teachers Association to create linkages between the schools and the communities, and inclusion champions to ensure that there is a structure within the school that look out for children with disabilities, and suggestion boxes. So we help the Ministry of Education to, if you like, to implement this system at scale within the secondary level. So if you think about it, this created deep awareness among the school actors. So both teachers and learners, they were able to know what is violence, and they're able to understand the type of violence, and if, in fact, they're even able to know what to do when there is violence. So with that knowledge, you definitely know that there will be the number of cases, violence will be heightened within the country. So we realized that despite this report, so when violence occurs, services are just not provided to support the victims. And hence what we did, we mapped out the service provider, because if you are a victim, you are abused, you want to be supported. Unfortunately, that support was not provided. So we worked with the Ministry of Education and, of course, the Ministry of Gender and Social Welfare as well, to map out service providers that are located in district and sub-district level, service providers that are closer to the schools. And most of these service providers are actually local actors, civil society organizations. And we created linkages between the service providers and the schools. Because, as you know, CSOs provide a wide range of services to support victims' access, for instance, psychosocial services, health services, and other related welfare services. So in Sierra Leone, there are a couple of organizations that are well renowned, the Rainbow Center, and there's also the one-stop centers. They are good example of local actors that are providing comprehensive services for survivors. So again, at district level, we also realize that the issues of disability are not a priority for government. So, which means even when these issues are manifested at school level, the inclusion champions, that is the structure within the school that look out for children with disabilities, they have no direct linkages with the district level actors, particularly the district education offices. So we assisted the Ministry of Education again and the Disability Commission in Sierra Leone to include organizations for persons with disability in the monthly district education meetings. So the organizations for persons with disability, which is a local civil society organization, which are local civil society organizations, are able to amplify and emphasize disability inclusion and ensure that the district education offices, they are able to act on issues of disability within the schools. And interestingly, we also identified that CSOs are relevant to our work, particularly the specialist organizations, the group that represent girls, the groups that represent children with disability, and the depth in which they work with schools or communities. So what we did was always to train and mentor them, but also to include them in our work, because it's easy to carve out specific bits and pieces and throw that to civil society organization or local actors and say, look, can you do this for us? Yes, that is what they are designed to do, but to help them grow, it's easy to embed them within the fabrics of what we do. So we did that a lot, but obviously to selected organizations that we feel are adding value to our work. Over to you, Mathilde.
Thanks, Barry. And last, I'll hand over to Virginie to explore how we approached capacity strengthening to amplify voices of local actors.
Yeah, thanks, Mathilde. Then let me start first with, reacting with some of the comments from Khadija, Antara, and Sudham questions, because I think those points are key questions, right? And for me, the first question in our discussion is, what do we mean by local actors? Because maybe there's a tendency to refer to local actors are, parents, communities, NGOs, but government are also local actors. And we need to make sure we are integrating them also in the support we are bringing to the coherence of this local system. And I think, for that perspective, Shuleba is a very interesting program, right? Because it's a governance program. So as such, we cannot reach out directly to communities or parents. We have to go through the system to do that. And, in doing so, we've realized when we did our map out of the system, of the local system, we realized that there were some community development officers, which could play a huge role in making sure that, the dots between the different actors and having a more integrated perspective and a stronger coherence, they were not playing their role because they were not perceived as education actors. So they were left aside by, so in Tanzania, you have, let's say, two ministries working on education. You have the Central Ministry of Education, as in many countries, doing the policy, standards, norm. And then in terms of implementation, you have now the Prime Minister Office for Regional Offices. But in the region, in this PMO RALG, as we call it, we were working mainly with education actors. And it didn't come into mind of, us at the beginning, to be honest, but also to the education people within PMO RALG to have those community development officers to be integrated in the local system, because they are the one who can reach out to the families, to the communities, making sure they are aware of their role, they can play a role. And you know, so when we started to work on climate and environment in Shulebara, for instance, we went to Katavi once, you know, doing field visits with different stakeholders from the central government, and we were going to school, and we realized that, you know, they had no trees. It was, Katavis can be a very hot regions, and they had no trees there to protect, you know, the children, to make the temperature decrease, so that, you know, to make sure that it was easier for children to learn and also support access to education and all of that. And then what happened is that in that school, they had planted trees, but they didn't get the support of the Tanzanian Forest Services Agency, so that they planted the trees in the bad season, because they didn't have support from the system. But there is an agency in the system which role is support to all different kind of actors, including schools, to plant those trees. So our role in Shulebara, I mean, and not only because it's a government program, it's really to support the systems at the different level, to join the dots and to approach education through different lenses, not only from an education perspective, but also from a climate and environment perspective, from a PFM perspective, from a planning perspective. So that, you know, because what happened very often in terms of governance, right, it's a very compartmented, very, you know, system. So in Tanzania, you have two ministries. They don't necessarily coordinate and communicate as efficiently as possible. But that situation, you find it at the different level of the system. So when you discuss with REOs, the regional officers of our education, then they have, you know, this very education perspective, but they don't necessarily link that to other pieces. And I think our role, if we want to strengthen systems and ensure that coherence, is to make sure that all the actors, should they be state actors or non-state actors, are aware of the role, again, that they have a role to play, understand their role, and give them the tools to efficiently be playing that role. So that the question that, you know, you were asking, Khadija, about, you know, the niche versus the wider system, I don't think I don't see it that way, because for me, we need to work on the two sides of it. I mean, like for instance, some parents will only have time and availability, resources to be working at the niche level, let's put it that way. But, you know, maybe one of our roles is also to support communities or NGOs to coordinate themselves, so that they can afterwards be represented at the different level within the system. So for instance, I mean, very often in countries, you have local education forum, right? The thing is that those forums are being led and organized by governments. So very often the government entities, they don't invite the parents or the communities because it's easier for them and they don't really know how to do it. So maybe our role is to make sure that in those fora, you have all the different stakeholders which are part of the system and which are being represented. And very often you even have the legal and the policy background to do so. It's just that, you know, state actors, they just don't really bother to invite those people, or they feel that they don't have much to say. So for me, I mean, I think the question here, Mathilde, it's really much about how do we create the space for change. And you know, based on Shulebara and DRC, but specifically on Shulebara as a government program, I mean, there is always a way to create space for change. And as we said earlier with Alicia example as well, is that it's about mapping out, understanding the dynamics of power. And from there, then you can see where are the weaknesses in the system, where there's a need to join the dots. And I think that's where we need to come in. I'm going to pause here. Thanks.
Thanks, Virginie. And yes, I think we very often forget this wider ecosystem, that we're not just speaking about local NGOs, and there's even such a variety of people and structures within the local NGOs. But we're speaking here, we're speaking of a much broader group, a much more distinct group of any structure really, or any entity that is part of the ecosystem de facto and needs to know exactly what their place is, what their place could be, and our role maybe is to amplify their voices, is to help them sustain that in a way that maybe we as the Cambridge Education, but other organizations as well are not required. We shouldn't be required. There is this broader ecosystem which is already existing. It's just not really, sometimes not speaking to each other, the different pieces. Our last question speaks to that, so I think it's good that we're moving to this now. Is giving the constraints posed by donor rules, compliance requirements, risk thresholds, we all know that. What does meaningful localization actually require in future programs? And what should donors and governments change to make genuine partnerships with local actors possible? Again, local actors in the broader definition. And I'll hand over first to Alicia to discuss how we as Cambridge Education evolved a little bit throughout the years and are now working differently on these aspects.
Sure, thank you. One of the things that we did in towards the end of the Girls Education Challenge was identify specifically our smaller women-led partners and conduct a sort of series of interviews really to try and understand what were the challenges that they faced, what do they wish that we had done differently or done better. And one of the things that really came up highly unsurprisingly was around resources. But it wasn't just, you know, the budgets were too small, etc. It was that a lot of the resources were directed around them as delivery mechanisms, resources that would allow them to deliver the outcomes for the program, which of course was very, very important. But they were saying, we need HR people, we need a stronger finance department, we need someone who can write great proposals for us, we need someone who is really well connected with local government to link us in. That's what we need. And those, you know, the program did not respond to those kind of capacity gaps, which was a very fair reflection. So when we went into LIFT, we wanted to understand, yes, who are the local actors who are really important for out of school issues, but what do they really need as organizations that can both deliver their own strategic objectives, but also play that role of system strengthening, even if it's really kind of micro localized accountability, even if it's ability to hold a head teacher to account, not necessarily sort of big system strengthening in inverted commas, that coherence at a much, much lower level. It was those kind of things that we wanted to try and program for and budget for from the start. But I do think it's been really, really challenging under pressures. There's just pressures all over the place that mean that you end up doing things that do distract from that wider goal of wanting to really align with their own organizational priorities. And just to give a quick example of one of our partners, they're called FMI, and such a great example of a partner with deep contextual knowledge, 2 secondary school students who could see that their friendship group that they'd grown up with, these young men who'd grown up together since they were about 6-7 years old, saw that as they got older and older, members of that friendship group were dropping out. They were leaving school, and it was just ended up the 2 of them finishing secondary school together. So they decided to start a small CSO. It's now become an NGO, but to try and tackle the issue of why teenagers in their community were dropping out on a really, really small scale. That CSO is it's a partner who so far in the district that they work in, we see the lowest re-dropout rates. We're seeing that those children are reporting really thriving in school as much as our monitoring data can tell us that they are. The district government is so impressed that they've started to directly fund that organization, which is really incredible, almost using them as an implementing partner, a direct mechanism themselves. When our finance team and other colleagues went to their office in the early days, they would come back to Kigali completely shocked that the office was just like there was no chair, there was just a desk, there was no computer, there was certainly no accounts. It was a very, very small outfit with no real ability to do things like generate financial reports, certainly no kind of safeguarding structure that you might expect. And we wanted to make sure that how do we amplify all their strengths while really responding to what they need, when many of those needs, frankly, are just about putting more money into the situation. And if we need donors who are willing to understand that and to align with it, and also if not, to understand that sometimes we have to take a risk. In working with them, the financial risk is higher than if we work with a large INGO. Are we willing to live with that? I think we are, and we should be. But do we have consensus on that as a whole? I don't know. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia, for a great example. I'll go to Virginie now for the same question.
Thanks, Mathilde. So, I mean, let me share my example. I mean, my thinking and maybe my, I don't know, wish as well. So, I mean, in Schreber again, we have a very interesting mechanism, which I'm sure some of you already know about. It's the EP4R. So, it's education performance based on results, right? So, it's a very interesting and useful mechanism which works really well, especially at the central level. My views based on my experience, I mean, in Tanzania, in DRC, is that having some kind of similar mechanism at regional or local level would be very interesting. I mean, we know that resources are decreasing, right? But maybe having some kind of mechanism where you have specific DLIs for the regional or the local authorities, for them to make sure they embed in the system the local non-state actors, and all together they address the issues. I think that would be very interesting. And meanwhile, I mean, what I think is that, because what I was telling you earlier is that if we take the example of Tanzania, we've seen that some of the, the local authorities in charge of the education sector, they don't necessarily have the skills. They're coming from, most of them, they are former teachers, which is great because they have this pedagogic perspective, they have this education perspective. But when it comes to management, when it comes to managing a sector, you need to also have skills in planning, and you need to have skills in M&E. You need to be able to understand the data within your district. What is the data telling you about the story in your district? And very often they don't have that. So I think then those DLIs could also be linked to that kind of performance, but it also requires some technical assistance. And then I think there is a role for us and also for the donors, because very often when we have a program in the education sector, we tend to, hire education specialists, when very often the issue is not education as such, it's governance. So you need to have people within your team who can bring that governance and system strengthening perspective. So you need to have PFM people. You need to have planning people. You need to have governance people that can bring that technicality to the different layers within the system. Because very often the education skills are already there. What's not there, it's the management skills. And then I think for me, having those two mechanisms working all together, it doesn't necessarily would request a lot of resources. Because whenever you have managers understanding what is at stake, and we've seen that in Tanzania, we've met with REOs and DEOs who have this perspective. They understand that, and they have great results, because they're coming in with this perspective. And then once they understand what is at stake in their region or local or district, then, I mean, from almost one day to another, you can see major changes. So I think we need those mechanisms, those financial mechanisms in place. We need technical assistance, which goes beyond education and is focused on governance from my perspective. We also need donors to understand that change takes time. And, you can't, because change, what we're talking about in terms of systems, yes, you have the policies, you have the norms, the standards, but that's the easy piece, right? Then afterward, you have to make sure that, the behaviors are, aligned to those norms and standards. And it takes time. We all know that. And when we want to change our habits of working or, of our daily life, it takes us a long time to internalize the new practices. What is it that I need to do? Why am I requested to have according to new practices? And why should I do that changes? So I think this is for me very important also, that this time dimension is a very key one. And I think not all the donors understand that perspective as well. I'm going to stop here, Mathilde.
Thanks, Virginie. And finally, I'll hand over to Barry to speak to us about the transition of Lewilan towards its future self.
Okay, no, thank you again. So I think I want to throw the line with Virginie, and maybe I also use this opportunity to reflect on Khadija's question on that there appears to be a tension emerging between local actors by forcing or asking them to just take bits and pieces, if you like. And many local organizations, as we all know, are actually created by less influential and less experienced people. For instance, a young woman, based on her experiences, might decide to open a local organization to assist pregnant learners or out-of-school girls. Or a disabled person can open an organization to support people with disabilities. These are the kinds of local organizations that we're actually working with. They are either one-man or woman organization, or they are owned by a handful of less influential people who are trying to represent specific groups. And again, I think we should recognize that local actors, they just don't have access to the technical and financial resources that formidable organizations have. Hence, they are mostly confined to their localities, addressing whatever is handed to them by large and formidable organizations. And local CSOs cannot easily attract, in fact, they cannot easily attract anyone in this call. So most of us that are currently in this call, it's just difficult for them to be able to engage us either as consultant or as staff. They don't have the experiences or the influence or relationship to grow their businesses. So I think they're just used based on needs. I think that's something that needs to be recognized. And I think government and donors need to make deliberate and concerted effort to empower local actors. So for me, I think one of the ways to do that is to identify local organizations with potential. Not all local organizations, by the way, have potential. Some of them are just representing just this one man with a portfolio who doesn't represent any group. All what they are representing is their interest and their pockets. And so I think it's always good to identify those with good potential and support them to grow. This including awarding them with programs that can allow them to recruit top-notch staff and build their technical, professional, and operational capabilities. And again, I think because of all of those gaps, and also to keep Cambridge Education's legacy, we are creating a local entity here in Sierra Leone that will be in alliance with local organizations around Africa, including Ghana and potentially Rwanda, and many other countries, actually. This organization will be named Lewilan after the program, after the FCDO-funded Lewilan program, that has implemented secondary education in programs in this country for about a decade. We are using all of our experiences and that we've accumulated over the years, in working with, and also both our experiences with working with international and local actors to create this entity, continue the legacy of Lewilan. And again, the emphasis is still on education to assist the Ministry of Education improve learning outcomes in Sierra Leone. with this organization, we want to challenge the status quo. We want to change the narrative by delivering top-notch projects to the standards of formidable organizations. So do look out for our stories and our successes in the coming years. Obviously, we look forward to your support. But for us, it's actually to change this perspective that local organization doesn't deliver. We are putting together a formidable team, people who are used to implementing large-scale system strengthening programs that contribute immensely to improved learning outcomes in our different locations. Thank you, and over to you, Mathilde.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks to all three presenters. We have a little bit of time for questions and comments. I know mostly it's been comments, so please put them in the chat for those who haven't, or I think you can also raise your hand directly. And in the meantime, I wanted to maybe give Khadija, if you would like to speak a little bit about your very first point, because Virginie and Barry started to answer, and I think it's just interesting to continue this discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I think it has been discussed in lots of different angles. I mean, really interesting. Thank you all for your presentations and for your contributions. I think what I was trying to unpick, and maybe people want to comment on it a little bit more, is that as we talk about the ecosystem and we talk about roles and responsibilities across the ecosystem, we have learned and understood more and more over the years how to work with different types of local organizations. There's not obviously just one kind. And I was reflecting on the fact that, you know, I think Barry, maybe a little bit to the point that you just made, what is and I use this word advisedly, but like, they bring different value and they bring different contributions, and we don't want to collapse the entire ecosystem to make a whole bunch of similar organizations who do similar things. Its richness is due to their differences and their willingness to work at different levels, including our own. You know, we are a part of the ecosystem, or have been to date, a part of the ecosystem as well, as Virginie said, various different levels and members of the federal and local governments. So thinking about it as an ecosystem and thinking about local actors as part of that ecosystem and thinking about the different roles and responsibilities, I think that's a little bit what I was pushing at. How do we meet them where they are? How do we ensure that they move forward in the ways they want to move forward, in ways that are valuable to them and to the wider ecosystem, not deciding that we need organizations to be of a certain kind or to move in a certain direction? I mean, who are we to decide, basically?
I think it's a great point. Alicia, Virginie, or Barry, or Antara, any of you would like to comment and like add to this?
And can I jump in here? I think it's a great point. I think it's always good to recognize the diversity of local actors, civil society organizations. I think they are called civil society organizations because by definition, it's anything outside family, outside the family, but not government. So it is that diversity. So in fact, for me, what experiences have showed, you'll see like a one-man or woman organization that represent a specific group. They add more value than a formidable local organization that sits nationally. So this organization sits in one forgotten community in a country, but they represent significant value, just addressing issues in their localities for the people in those communities. So you will see formidable organizations seated there. They just have the attention of the donors. They can attract funding. They're able to attend national forums where they can meet, if you like, good people, but they don't impact communities. They don't represent anyone. I think I mentioned that in my video. Is how do you identify those? How do you support those? How do you ensure that when you funnel your money in my previous work life, I spent like 7-8 years working with civil society organization. I was able to identify that quickly. If you like, the guys with big offices here in Freetown, it's just easy. They have access to you. All what they do is to talk. to talk. They don't do anything serious. You meet one woman in one forgotten part of the country, you realize that actually these are the ones that are making the changes. These are the ones that are empowering women, girls, and children. So it's always good to recognize that.
Yeah, true. Antara, please go ahead.
Bravo, Mohammed. I couldn't agree more. And it just, reflecting on having just come from being a global actor, it just feels like global organizations, global processes almost just really mess up the incentives at local level, at a national level, or even at a community level for actors there. Because, as you said, there are some civil society organizations, and sometimes these are the ones who are the most attractive to donors, but they're most attractive to donors because they've done something right in their processes and they can talk to them. And by talk to them, I mean even have a particular accent of the language, to be able to converse with the person who holds the purse strings, whether that's in DC or New York or Paris or wherever. So just really wanted to highlight that there is sort of this, we talk about public good, but there's also a public bad of monies coming in globally on the incentives for actors. So, some national actors, when they're civil society organizations, the bigger ones, the sexier ones, the more sophisticated ones, I have sometimes found that they're the ones who are least interested in coordinating and collaborating with other organizations because they have this pressure to keep, building their organization. And this is not to say that they're not doing great work in and of itself in supporting children and supporting schools and supporting ministries. But just the way the economy, the political economy works, they have very little incentive to collaborate and all the incentive to continue to evolve and grow in their particular way. And I have seen this in country after country, in Africa, in Asia, in South Asia. So just wanted to reflect on that. I also wanted to reflect on, on this idea of, Virginia, you talked about district government being a local actor. I would say government is always a duty bearer. And so its responsibility and role is always, we have to see it as different. Sure, we need to support government. We need to always be with government. I mean, when they are doing the things that they're supposed to do, but they have a responsibility that nobody else does because they are in power because people have voted for them to provide for people. So in that sense, to me, we are all supporting, if we're supporting people and government is the representative of the people, our job is always to help and hold government accountable. And then obviously we get into the huge role of what local actors can do in holding governments accountable, which nobody else can do. But just wanted to throw that into the mix.
Thanks. Maybe Mathilde on this last part. Yeah, I get your perspective, Antara, and I think it's not an easy point, right? But I mean, for me, the local actors are part of the ecosystem, and if we want, those dynamics, I mean, for those local actors, we are referring to be able to into account. They need to be part of the local, government framework or fora that are in place, right? And if they are not aware, they feel like they're not legitimate or they don't have the skills to be part of that, then how do we do, right? And I think I really like Khadija, perspective. Yes, we ourselves are part of this dynamic. And the question is, and it will really depend on all the each country, or even each region. Like, working in South Kivu is very different from working in Equateur, or working in Katavi is very different from working in Pwani. So I think even this mapping out we were talking about, and those power of dynamics we are referring to are very different from one place to another, and we really need to adjust to the different actors you're working with. But for me, I think as long as you have this dichotomy between non-state actors and state actors, then I think we are missing something, because in the end, it's all together that they need to work. And very often state actors, they are themselves parents, and they see the point of, at some point, when you start doing some training, raising awareness, they feel they understand the need for that to change as well. And then they're becoming more open to those changes. And how do you do that? How can you make sure that, it's not only discussion within the state actors, but what about the others? But then I think where, to be honest, I haven't found yet all the answers, or I'm not clear. What you were saying, because we see many NGOs, right, which are very well known from the donors, because as you say, their representatives are very well articulated. They understand very well the donors' language, the program's language, and because sometimes it's easier, or because we need to make sure we can we have someone we can talk to and can have as a voice that can be heard from the government people. We tend to focus on those people. But what about the others? And I think for me, that's really based on especially on DRC example, that's really where you can make a difference. I was really, when we started to see women, going in the streets with their, how do you say in English, pancarte, Mathilde, you will have to help me. And we was asking for free education for their children because it was in the constitution. I think we started to see some changes in their perspective, and for them to understand that yes, they had a role to play, and yes, they had the ability to push back on the government and ask for accountability mechanism. But how do you do that? I think it's really very different from one country again to another. I don't think there is any recipe in that. Also because it's so political sensitive, right? You want to make sure that you're not going to put them at risk as well, right? So yeah.
And I would add that the limits between government or state or non-state is sometimes so blurry. It's very, you have these civil society organizations which are practically government when they've been funded by the First Lady, or, they're very highly political in some places. And in other places, like in DRC, you have the faith-based administration of schools, and they administer like 70% of total schools. So they haven't been elected, they haven't been nominated by government, but they hold tremendous power over their communities. So it's like everything is political at the end, and I agree that yes, they just all need to work together and fall into the best piece where they can raise their voices and convince and amplify and etc. But it's not easy and highly dependent on every context. That's where we found political economy analysis and such quite interesting, actually, to analyze the context before doing anything. Alicia, did you want to add something to this broader point?
I was just thinking about how there is sometimes a cost to when those organizations are really disadvantaged by not having access to information or different ways of working that we might think of as more system strengthening. So I was just thinking about the fact that many of our smaller organizations have been telling us that over the last 3 to 5 years, really, a lot of their very small budgets that are dedicated to out of school related activities have been spent on things that they now understand should be covered by the school or by local government. So, for example, sometimes payments have been made to teachers for running things like girls' clubs or SRHR clubs during the week, and those incentives did not need to be paid. And it's as sort of as simple as having a conversation with the head teacher and saying, we know that the national guidelines that teachers don't need to be paid for this. It's part of the curriculum. It's within the working week. It's not a very controversial conversation to have, but those organisations didn't know that conversation could even be had. And so I think, yes, of course, we need to respect that kind of organic niche and their own strategic objectives and what they want to do, but also be aware that it's unfair for them. They're losing resources and they're losing opportunities because of not being tapped into different networks or different or aware of different practices that would really enhance their work. And I feel that that is maybe a role that I'm not sure whether it is international organizations, but there's some role that other types of actors can play in helping, especially those really small organizations, navigate that. Otherwise, I feel like there'll just be a pattern that goes on, that it just continues to be reproduced, where they lose out on opportunities, even when they're very micro, and often around accountability, but they're not able to take advantage of them.
Barry, please go ahead.
Yeah. So maybe just to maybe respond a bit on Alicia's point around paying, if you like, stipend or some form of making payment for school level actors to organize, to actually do their work. And I think it's not just local organizations that are doing that. What I've seen in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia is the World Bank funded program, UNICEF programs are actually doing the same. They pay for they pay government actors to do their work. For instance, when we started implementing in 2017, late 2016, early 2017 here in Sierra Leone, one big challenge we face is that we are not passing funds to the government system, and that we are making payment. Like if we are organizing an activity with the Ministry of Education, for instance, we'll make direct payment to caterers, to participants. We are training 1,000 teachers. We'll give them all their DSAs and travel-related costs. We'll pay directly to individuals. So it is that detail. So to get that understanding, it took us serious meetings, serious grinding, and also it is our personalities as project leaders. What we sell, what I sell as a project leader is that influence, is able to meet the political and technical leaders of government and to say to them, this is what we are offering. You are actually not helping us to deliver our work. And they are the duty bearers. We are helping them to deliver their work. So that problem actually is not just on local organizations. In fact, I think majority of INGOs also do that. People are bribing their way to get the attention of government. I think that's the honest truth. And I think one other thing that I want to dwell on is the way civil society organizations work. Because of their diversity, what we have realized when you bring them together into networks based on either location or based on thematics, they are always powerful. That will always provide platforms for organizations that represent specific vulnerable groups, because they are isolated. They are just they are hidden. So if you include them in a network, you get confidence. So you're able to provide them that kind of support. The final thing I want to dwell in, which is an experience that I always like to share. When we started again with implementing in Sierra Leone, our processes, our bureaucracies are so cumbersome. It's so difficult for local caterers, for instance, to get into our systems. So I remember in some of the districts where you don't have bank account, but you have these women who are offering catering services. And we were a large-scale teacher training program. We train like 3,000-4,000 teachers per term. So that's a huge opportunity for those organizations. I remember my operations manager then, Lady Khadija, she went to this district. They talked to these women to say that, look, you just need to register your organizations, you need to open a bank account, we will work with you. So fast forward 5-6 years, our relationship with these organizations, particularly these women, their catering services has grown into restaurants. They are serving their communities. So if you like, we need to be deliberate. We need to make effort to work with local actors. It should be part of everything that we do, or else this status quo will continue. Over.
Thanks, Barry. I think in order not to run out of time, I'll stop the questions and answers here and give the floor to Antara for our closing remarks. I just wanted to say before that the webinar has been recorded and will be shared, I think, in our YouTube channel in a few days. And we are also working on some papers, learning briefs, etc., again, to try and share what we've learned over the past 40 plus years, what worked, what didn't, why, etc. So watch this space as well for that. Thank you so much, and Antara, over to you.
Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you so much, Virginie, Alicia, and Mohammed. This has been such an important and stimulating conversation, and I'm also just really happy that I think we were able to speak quite honestly about some of the challenges that we see. I want to recognize all the friends in the chat who also joined in: Susan, Khadija, Helen, Caroline, and the colleague who made the point, Clive. So thank you. This has been a really, really stimulating conversation. My own bias is obviously that I think people should always be responsible for determining what they want in their lives and in their children's lives. And I was just reflecting, I live here in New York City, a deeply unequal place, and education is particularly contested. We have the good fortune of living in a district that has great elementary schools, really high functioning elementary schools, and there's just a lot of infrastructure around supporting that. And these schools are obviously free. So I have a daughter who's 5.5 and who benefits from this. And the first time I saw her classroom coming from India, where government schools are not this well resourced in most cases, I was in tears at the thought that not every child in the world gets to have this. Not every parent in the world is able to send their child to a beautiful classroom filled with interesting child-friendly materials and teachers who are really committed. Not to mention free, high-quality food and public transport and all of that. But I'm just starting with that. I wanted to end with that point, because what every child deserves is that. So if that is the end point, I cannot even imagine how my district would respond if an external actor, no matter if it's the World Bank or the UN or the government of France, came in and said, hey, we want to influence this. We want to give some money to train the teachers better. We want to do X, Y, Z for the children. We want to, do this to the curricula. We would be up in arms. We would be in a furor, right? Like, why does anybody else get to come in and make those calls? I mean, there's constantly discussion, even just between federal and state and city. Of course, the situations are different. The places in which Cambridge Education is working do not have resources. But the question still arises, just because the resources are not there at that level, in that community, in that district, in that country, do other people get to make decisions on what children learn and how they learn? It seems so unfair if it's not something we would be okay with for our own families. Why should we be okay with it? Because it is somebody else's family, just because they're poor. So I just wanted to share that reflection and a couple of points that I wanted to sort of emphasize from what my colleagues have said. Alicia, you were talking about the most marginalized kids and how they're actually the hardest to find and therefore the most expensive to serve and hardest to keep in school after day one. And I think you brought up that example of the group of friends and those two young men who then decided to help other boys and children stay in school. I think this is such an important point, because local actors are able to provide what we as global actors, or even just actors from another country, are not able to provide. They know where those kids are, and they know why they're not in school, and they know how to get them to school because this is their lived experience. And I just cannot emphasize that enough. And similarly, they're able to do that. Why? Because they're the best at finding the value proposition of education. We all know that education does not have the same value proposition for all families. A family who does not have enough food to eat, whose fields have been taken over because of debt to a moneylender, the value proposition of sending their 14-year-old to school is not the same as it would be for us. And so we need those local actors because they will be able to find that value proposition, and they will be able to make the case much more effectively than we can. So even if you don't believe in the social justice mission of working with local actors, they're just much more likely to be effective. I also really appreciated the point made that local actors are all very different, and we are sort of exoticizing and in our own way by grouping it all in the same group. And I think everybody agrees with that. And obviously it means, there are different kinds of actors, but they all have an incentive that is different and more than any of us coming in from outside the country. And then finally, I think local actors, the last point I'll make is, an actor on the ground is much more able to withstand the siloization that comes from global budgets, from global aid budgets. The siloization of education and health and governance and so on, this sits in institutions. It sits in their bank accounts. It sits in UNICEF, we call it WBS, the codes within those organizations. It doesn't work in people's lives. And it is an organization that works with children on the ground, that works with families on the ground, that works with teachers on the ground, is best able to resist that and say, actually, the woman teacher is best placed to lead the conversation with the women-led CSO, the point that one of my colleagues, Alicia, raised, because they are the same person. They are neighbors. They're facing the same issues. And they're also able to say, hey, the most compelling argument for supporting families to send their kids to school, even when it's a huge opportunity cost for them, is to say, this is going to prevent substance abuse. This is going to prevent being recruited by extremist agencies and so on and so forth. I know we're out of time, so I'll stop there. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to speak to all of the experts in this conversation. Thank you so much for including me. Back to you, Mathilde.
Thank you, Antara, for great closing remarks as well. No, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And watch this space. You'll have the recording if you want to. You'll have papers for the closure of Cambridge Education in the next few weeks and months. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.